The boundless expanse of the American frontier was a punishing landscape for those seeking a new life in the West. Weary travelers charting their course across the desolate prairies endured relentless isolation, often yearning for nothing more than the comforting glow of a hearth and a safe haven for the night. Yet, out in that sprawling wilderness, what could be more terrifying than a ruthless highwayman lying in wait? The answer is the welcoming smile of a seemingly ordinary, hospitable family. In the quiet plains of Kansas, one such pioneer household transformed their modest wayside inn into a clandestine slaughterhouse. Their unspeakable crimes would forever scar the nation's history, but it is their sudden, ghostly vanishing into the ether that remains their most chilling legacy. In the autumn of 1871, the landscape of Labette County, Kansas, was a sea of undulating tallgrass, an ocean of green and gold that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. This was the American West in its rawest form, beautiful, expansive, and profoundly isolating. Carved through this desolate wilderness was the Osage Trail, a vital artery for pioneers, cattle drivers, and solitary drifters seeking prosperity on the frontier. Yet, it was a perilous journey. The sheer emptiness of the plains could play tricks on the mind, creating a suffocating sense of vulnerability. A traveler could ride for days without seeing another living soul, surrounded only by the haunting, uninterrupted howl of the prairie wind. It was into this remote expanse that a family of 4 arrived, claiming a 160-acre plot of land alongside the heavily trafficked trail. They were the Benders. At first glance, they appeared to be just another group of immigrant homesteaders pursuing the promise of the West. But their arrival brought a subtle, chilling shift to the atmosphere of the county. The patriarch, John Bender Sr., was a hulking, broad-shouldered man around 60 years of age. His face was hidden behind a thick, unruly beard, and his deep-set eyes held a perpetually sullen glare. He spoke very little English, communicating mostly in guttural grunts or a harsh German dialect, and he rarely engaged with his sparse neighbors. His wife, Elvira, was equally unwelcoming. Nearing 60 herself, she was a heavy-set woman with a severe, weathered face. Elvira was known to be fiercely territorial, often scowling at anyone who dared approach their property. Her hostility was so pronounced that locals soon began referring to her privately as a she-devil. Together, the elder Benders cast a grim, foreboding shadow, entirely lacking the neighborly warmth and mutual reliance that usually bound isolated pioneer communities together. Their son, John Jr., who was in his mid-20s, offered no reassurance to those who met him. While tall and somewhat handsome, there was something deeply unnerving about the young man. He was prone to sudden, inexplicable fits of giggling, laughing at empty corners of the room or at comments that carried no humor whatsoever. Many neighbors dismissed him as a harmless half-wit, assuming his mind was simply unmoored. But beneath that vacant, smiling exterior lay a quiet, unsettling intensity that made solitary travelers instinctively check the heavy iron of their revolvers. The absolute anomaly of the household and the undeniable draw of the Bender property was the daughter, Kate. Around 23 years old, Kate was the antithesis of her grim, uninviting family. She was strikingly attractive, highly articulate, and carried herself with an unexpected magnetic charm. Unlike her parents, she spoke fluent English with only a trace of an accent, and she knew exactly how to captivate an audience. Kate aggressively promoted herself as a spiritual medium and a magnetic healer, distributing flyers in neighboring towns claiming she could cure blindness, deafness, and even commune with the dead. In an era deeply fascinated by spiritualism, Kate's mystical persona was a beacon. She was the charming, disarming face of the family, the perfect, enchanting lure in a landscape devoid of comfort. To capitalize on their strategic location along the Osage Trail, the family constructed a modest one-room timber cabin, stripping the surrounding land of its sparse trees. The structure was crude, functioning simultaneously as a residence, a dry goods store, and a wayside inn. Out front, a small sign promised hot meals, basic supplies, and a safe place to rest exhausted horses. Inside, the cabin was notoriously cramped. A large, heavy canvas wagon cover was strung across the middle of the room, physically dividing the public dining and store area from the family's private, unseen sleeping quarters in the back. To the dust-choked traveler emerging from the blinding expanse of the Kansas plains, the sight of smoke rising from the Bender cabin was a godsend. It meant a warm meal, a sip of whiskey, and the rare comfort of human conversation, often provided by the beautiful and attentive Kate. But the frontier is a place of illusions. Out here, where the law was distant and the nearest neighbor was miles away, isolation was a predator's greatest weapon. The weary travelers, stepping through the wooden door of the inn, believed they had found a sanctuary from the harshness of the trail. In truth, they were walking blindly into a meticulously crafted trap, leaving the vast open dangers of the prairie for the intimate, inescapable horror that waited just behind the canvas curtain. The interior of the Bender cabin was a masterclass in sinister spatial design, hiding a macabre reality behind the mundane facade of a frontier grocery. To the unsuspecting pioneer stepping out of the biting Kansas wind, the single-room dwelling offered a rustic, albeit cramped, sanctuary. The air inside was thick with the comforting scents of simmering meat, cheap pipe tobacco, and the burning oil of flickering lanterns. Yet, the most defining and fatal feature of this structure was a heavy, dirt-stained canvas wagon cover suspended entirely across the center of the floor space. This makeshift partition physically severed the public tavern and dining area from the Benders' private sleeping quarters at the rear. To the weary traveler, it was merely a primitive attempt at domestic privacy in a lawless land. In reality, it was the curtain of a deadly stage, carefully erected to conceal the mechanics of a human slaughterhouse. The Benders were astute, predatory judges of character and wealth. When a solitary rider arrived on the Osage Trail, particularly one whose horse was well-bred, whose clothing suggested prosperity, or whose pockets jingled with the heavy coin of a recent cattle sale, the family's dark choreography commenced. The guest would be warmly welcomed, relieved of their heavy coat, and directed to take their evening meal at the main dining table. With feigned, deferential hospitality, the Benders would invite the stranger to sit in what appeared to be the seat of honor. This specific wooden chair was strategically positioned so that the guest's back was pressed almost flush against the dividing canvas curtain. Exhausted, hungry, and profoundly relieved to be out of the unforgiving elements, the victim would sit down, entirely unaware that they had just placed their head within the jaws of a meticulously engineered trap. It was in these crucial, final moments that Kate Bender deployed her lethal psychological theater. Sitting directly across the narrow table from the doomed traveler, she became the ultimate distraction. Kate possessed a magnetic, almost hypnotic charisma that contrasted sharply with the bleak, weather-beaten reality of the prairie. As she served hot broth and poured strong spirits, she would engage the guest with a honeyed voice, weaving captivating tales of her supposed clairvoyant abilities. In an era deeply fascinated by spiritualism, Kate's claims of communing with the dead and possessing magnetic healing powers were incredibly alluring to lonely men far from home. She would lock her piercing eyes onto the traveler's gaze, speaking in hushed, intimate tones that demanded absolute focus. Her beauty and animated storytelling drew the victim's attention entirely forward, rendering them deaf to the subtle, deadly shifts occurring just inches behind their exposed neck. While the traveler was entirely mesmerized by the beautiful medium, a shadow would silently detach itself from the darkness of the private quarters. Either the hulking John Bender Sr. or his unsettlingly quiet son, John Jr., would creep up right behind the canvas partition. In their calloused hands, they gripped a massive, long-handled iron sledgehammer, a brutal tool typically reserved for driving railroad spikes or splitting heavy timber. Guided by the visible indentation of the victim's head, resting against the taut fabric of the curtain, the executioner would raise the heavy iron high into the dim light. With a single, devastating swing, the hammer would crash through the canvas, shattering the traveler's skull with terrifying, silent precision. There was no struggle, no warning, and no outcry to alert anyone on the trail outside. Only the sudden, sickening thud of bone giving way to blunt force. The aftermath of the fatal strike was executed with the chilling, practiced efficiency of an abattoir. Before the victim's heart had even stopped beating, a concealed trapdoor located directly beneath the dining table was thrown open. The lifeless or convulsing body was swiftly dragged backward behind the curtain or dropped directly into the gaping maw of the cellar below. To ensure absolute silence and prevent any agonizing moans from escaping the cabin, Elvira or one of the men would take a razor-sharp hunting knife and deeply slash the victim's throat. Down in the cramped, earthen pit, the corpse was systematically stripped of cash, gold pocketwatches, and any identifiable valuables. As the blood pooled in the foul-smelling, subterranean dark, the Benders would calmly mop the floorboards above, pull the canvas curtain straight, and patiently wait for the howling prairie wind to deliver their next guest. By the spring of 1873, the Benders' gruesome enterprise had operated in the cold shadows for over 18 months, claiming the lives of countless anonymous drifters whose absences went entirely unnoticed by the wider world. However, the delicate fabric of their bloody secret began to unravel rapidly with the disappearance of one specific man. Dr. William York was not a forgotten pioneer or a solitary drifter. He was a prominent, highly respected physician from Fort Scott, Kansas. On a routine journey returning home from Independence, Dr. York vanished without a trace along the Osage Trail. Unlike the vulnerable travelers who had previously fallen victim to the canvas curtain, Dr. York had deep ties to the community and a powerful family that possessed the relentless means to demand answers. When Dr. York failed to arrive, his brother, Senator Alexander York, refused to let the prairie quietly swallow him. A man of considerable wealth, political influence, and fierce determination, the senator mobilized an unprecedented response. He personally organized a heavily armed search party consisting of dozens of men, determined to retrace his brother's exact route inch by inch. For days, the formidable posse scoured the plains, questioning homesteaders, tracking the doctor's final known movements, and investigating every remote settlement. The trail of clues, including the testimonies of travelers who had seen the doctor heading toward that specific stretch of the trail, led them inexorably down the dusty path to the unassuming wooden cabin of the Bender family. When Senator York and a contingent of his men pushed open the heavy wooden door of the inn, the atmosphere inside the cramped, dimly lit cabin immediately turned hostile. The Benders, usually so adept at welcoming weary strangers, now faced a room full of suspicious, armed men demanding information. The canvas curtain hung heavy and motionless in the center of the room. During the tense interrogation, the family's carefully maintained facade began to show its first fractured seams. John Bender Sr. obstinately feigned complete ignorance. He retreated into his thick, guttural German dialect, shaking his head and waving his hands as if he could not comprehend a single word of the senator's English. Elvira, however, reacted with visceral fury. Her severe face contorted in anger, and she brandished a kitchen tool, aggressively ordering the men out of her home and insisting they were righteous people who knew nothing of any missing physician. Sensing the escalating danger and the very real threat of a vigilante hanging, Kate stepped forward, attempting to deploy her usual disarming charm. Her voice was steady, her smile placating, as she smoothly suggested that while they had not seen the doctor, her formidable clairvoyant abilities might be able to locate his spirit if the senator returned alone the following evening for a private séance. Senator York was not a man easily swayed by parlor tricks. He stared down the young woman, his instincts screaming that this strange, isolated family was hiding something deeply sinister behind their shifting eyes and contradictory statements. He stood his ground, demanding the right to search the private quarters. Yet, just as the confrontation threatened to boil over into outright violence, a deeply unsettling detail presented itself. One of the men in the search party, shifting his weight near the heavy oak dining table, suddenly paused, his face paling. A repugnant, distinctly coppery odor was slowly rising from the narrow gaps in the floorboards beneath their heavy riding boots. It was a thick, suffocating stench of decay, sweet and metallic, catching sharply in the back of the throat. But before the men could draw their weapons, pull back the braided rugs, and pry up the wood to uncover the true source of that sickening smell, a different kind of darkness violently intervened. Outside the cabin walls, the notoriously volatile Kansas weather had rapidly deteriorated. A massive, violent spring storm had rolled across the Osage Trail, throwing a blanket of premature, bruised purple night over the prairie. The wind began to howl with a deafening ferocity, rattling the thin timber walls of the cabin and threatening to tear the shingles from the roof. Torrential, freezing rain pounded against the glass, making the dirt roads entirely impassable and threatening to strand the large posse in the middle of nowhere without shelter. Confronted with the stubborn, aggressive denials of the family, lacking a formal legal warrant to tear the homestead apart by force and heavily pressured by the rapidly worsening tempest, Senator York made a fateful tactical decision. Unwilling to start a deadly shootout in the cramped, dark quarters, he ordered his men to withdraw. He leveled a final icy glare at John Bender Sr., warning the old man that the posse would return at first light with the full authority of the law to conduct a thorough excavation of the property. As the search party mounted their frightened horses and rode away into the driving, blinding rain, they left the wooden cabin standing isolated in the eye of the storm. The senator's decision to retreat was a perfectly reasoned, lawful choice made by a civilized man facing difficult circumstances. However, the Benders were not civilized people. As the sound of the posse's hooves faded into the thunder, the family knew their meticulously constructed slaughterhouse had finally been compromised. That night, under the cover of the raging tempest and the absolute darkness of the prairie, the family quietly packed their wagon. The storm that had forced the authorities away had simultaneously handed the cornered killers the exact golden window of opportunity they desperately needed. A few days later, when the violent spring tempest finally broke and the punishing Kansas sun returned to bake the prairie mud, Senator Alexander York and his heavily armed search party rode back to the property. They came prepared for a confrontation, carrying the full authority of the law, but the chilling silence that greeted them was far more unnerving than any gunfire. The homestead was entirely deserted. The family's wagon was missing, the livestock wandered aimlessly in a state of distress, and the heavy wooden door of the inn swung loosely on its iron hinges. The Benders, realizing their deadly charade had finally collapsed, had fled into the vast wilderness, leaving their accursed cabin behind. Stepping across the threshold, the search party was instantly assaulted by a sickening wave of putrefaction. With the family gone and the cabin sealed tight during the storm, the repugnant, coppery odor that had briefly distracted the men days earlier had intensified into an overpowering miasma of death. Tearing aside the braided rugs and wrestling the heavy oak dining table out of the way, the posse discovered the grim secret of the canvas curtain, a broad wooden trapdoor, meticulously nailed flush with the floorboards. When they pried it open with crowbars, a foul darkness yawned below. A brave volunteer, gripping a flickering lantern, lowered himself into the cramped earthen cellar. He found no corpses hidden in the gloom, but the sight illuminated by the lantern's glow was no less horrifying. The dirt floor of the pit was entirely saturated, caked thick with dark, congealed blood that had seeped deep into the soil over months of calculated, relentless slaughter. The realization struck the men with a cold, paralyzing dread. The cellar was merely a temporary holding pen, a subterranean drain for the bloodletting above. If the victims were not buried beneath the floorboards, they had to be concealed somewhere on the sprawling 160-acre homestead. Word of the blood-soaked pit spread quickly to the neighboring towns, and within hours, the property was swarming with hundreds of local volunteers armed with shovels, pickaxes, and a mounting sense of terror. Their attention was inevitably drawn to the rear of the cabin, where John Bender Sr. had planted a modest, carefully tended apple orchard. The ground beneath the fragile saplings bore the undeniable, telltale depressions of recently disturbed earth. The gruesome excavation began under the watchful, silent gaze of the open prairie. It did not take long before a spade struck something soft beneath the topsoil. Carefully brushing away the heavy dirt, the men unearthed the first set of remains, confirming the senator's darkest fears. It was Dr. William York. His body was pulled from the shallow grave, and the condition of the respected physician's corpse laid bare the ruthless methodology of the killers. The back of his skull had been entirely crushed by a devastating, localized blow from a heavy sledgehammer, and his throat had been slashed from ear to ear with a razor-sharp blade, ensuring a swift and silent end before he was discarded like refuse. But the nightmare hidden beneath the roots of the apple trees was far from over. As the desperate, frantic digging continued throughout the orchard and into the surrounding vegetable gardens, the true, unfathomable scale of the Benders' enterprise was dragged into the harsh daylight. One by one, more bodies were exhumed from the soil. The final count yielded at least 11 victims, though many locals whispered that the vast prairie likely held even more forgotten souls. Among the recovered remains were not just wealthy cattlemen and solitary drifters, but the decaying bodies of a young woman and a small child, all subjected to the exact same merciless execution. Every skull was shattered. Every throat was violently cut. The discovery sent a shockwave of profound revulsion and blinding fury throughout the frontier settlements. It was a level of depravity that defied the harsh but communal logic of the pioneer lifestyle. These were not the desperate, chaotic acts of starving bandits or wild outlaws, but the methodical, industrialized murders orchestrated by a seemingly unremarkable family. The community was left entirely paralyzed by a chilling, heart-stopping realization. The smiling daughter who offered them spiritual comfort, the quiet father who sold them tobacco, and the old mother who tended the crops had been calmly dining above a slaughterhouse, burying a cemetery of butchered guests just yards from where they slept. The discovery of the apple orchard graveyard ignited one of the most extensive and frantic manhunts in American frontier history. The governor of Kansas quickly issued heavily publicized arrest warrants, and Senator Alexander York offered a staggering personal reward for the capture of his brother's killers, dead or alive. The Bender family, with their distinctive appearances, odd mannerisms, and heavy accents, should have been remarkably easy to track across the open plains. Yet, in what remains the most chilling twist of this entire macabre saga, the four murderers had vanished entirely. They dissolved into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West as completely as if the prairie earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. In the absence of formal justice, the vacuum was quickly filled by a whirlwind of wild rumors and enduring frontier legends. Some locals whispered that a ruthless posse of vigilantes had indeed caught up with the fleeing wagon just days after the Benders' escape. According to this violent law, the pursuers dispensed swift, brutal vigilante justice, executing the entire family on the prairie and burying their bodies in unmarked, shallow graves to keep the matter quiet and the bounty money undivided. Others maintained a far more disturbing theory, that the Benders had successfully outrun the law, abandoning their weary horses near a distant railhead and boarding a train. By scattering into the crowded, anonymous slums of the East Coast or disappearing deeper into the lawless territories further west, they could have easily lived out the rest of their days unpunished. Over the next several decades, countless sightings were reported across the country, and several older women were even arrested under the suspicion of being the infamous Kate Bender. But every single lead ultimately crumbled under legal scrutiny. The frustrating, terrifying historical truth is that the ultimate fate of the Bloody Benders has never been resolved. They committed industrial-scale murder in plain sight, accumulated a small fortune in stolen pioneer gold, and successfully walked away from the epicenter of their crimes without ever facing a judge, a jury, or the hangman's noose. Their unprecedented disappearance cemented their dark legacy, elevating them from mere frontier criminals to the status of a permanent, haunting American myth. When reflecting upon the sheer, calculated depravity of the Bender family, one is inevitably drawn back to the literary observations of Sherlock Holmes regarding the isolated countryside. We are often conditioned to believe that the darkest corners of human nature are exclusively confined to the smog-choked, vilest alleys of London, or the crowded, impoverished slums of an industrial metropolis. Yet, the tragedy of the Osage Trail brutally illustrates the terrifying fragility of that assumption. The Benders hid their hellish cruelty behind the most disarming, innocent facade imaginable. A humble pioneer family offering a warm meal and a safe haven to the weary traveler. Their story remains a stark, enduring reminder that the most profound wickedness does not require the cover of a dark city street. It can flourish just as easily and far more quietly beneath the smiling, beautiful, and utterly indifferent skies of the rural landscape. You've been listening to my channel. If you found yourself captivated by this dark chapter of pioneer history, please leave a thumbs up, comment, rating, or review, as it truly helps others discover the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. What is your personal theory on how the Bender family managed to escape, and where do you think they finally disappeared to? For those who wish to support the show further, Patreon members get access to ad-free, audio-only episodes, and you can also sign up for my free newsletter via the website for all future updates. A special thank you to everyone supporting the show, whether through Patreon, YouTube, or simply by taking the time to listen and share the episodes. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll be back soon with another historical, true crime episode.